Well, John Daley, the government's got itself into strife with the budget. What do you think? What do you think is at the heart of that? Why has that happened?
It's interesting. They appear to have won the argument that there is a genuine budget problem. I don't think that part of it's going too badly. I think the real issues are that they have got a budget which is seen as unfair, and I think there's probably good reasons why it's seen as unfair.
Because it is unfair.
Yeah, it is unfair. And then secondly, it's got a number of things in it which are simply policy-owned goals. In the long run, they're actually going to hurt the country. And a combination of that unfairness plus policy-owned goals has meant that the Senate feels very emboldened to reject the whole lot.
So list for me the things that you regard rationally as unfair.
Well, if you look at what it's doing to people at the bottom, we have changes to New Start that mean that people who are under the age of 30 will essentially only be able to get New Start for 6 months in every 12 if they're not studying. For a 29-year-old, that's pretty tough. We know that people who are in that situation are much more likely to come from low-income backgrounds themselves and so less likely to have family support. We know that people in that situation are often unemployed through no fault of their own. Youth unemployment is running at 15%. It's ticked up as the economy has slowed. That's completely normal. It's exactly what you'd expect. The first thing that goes when the economy is slower is people stop hiring new people. So that's particularly unfair. You've then got the changes to medical co-payments. Again, contrary to popular belief, Australians already pay more for their health than people in many other countries. And the co-payments, yes, will dissuade people from going to the doctor who didn't need to go to the doctor. But just as much, in fact, probably more, they will dissuade people from going to the doctor who did need to go. And again, it's something which, at least as a proportion of income, is going to hit a lot more people at the bottom. Then you have the changes to higher education so that students will contribute more. Again, that's actually probably quite a sensible measure, but it's going to hit people who, at least at the moment, have relatively less in the way of income. Then you have the changes to proposed paid parental leave, which is essentially going to be a benefit for rich people. Essentially, it means that women who are on relatively higher incomes will get substantially more than they do at the moment. Women who are on low incomes will get more or less exactly what they do get at the moment. Women with no income will get nothing out of the entire exercise. And when you look at what's happened on the tax side, there's substantial bracket creep built into the budget. And at least as a percentage of income, that has the most impact on people in middle income brackets. No impact, of course, on people at the bottom because they don't pay tax, but actually relatively little impact on people at the top. So you put all of those things together and you wind up with a budget which is, at least in percentage of income terms, hitting people at the bottom much harder than it's hitting people at the top.
Right, so what should they do? You've said that they should do something on negative gearing and super, really. That's what they really ought to do. What do you think they should do about negative gearing?
On negative gearing, our suggestion would be that where assets are, where you've invested in assets and you've made a loss on those assets, so essentially the cost of the asset, particularly the interest you're paying, is more than the income from the asset, that's fine. You should not be allowed to claim that loss against other earned income, which of course is the essence of negative gearing. You should be allowed to capitalise that loss, and at the point that you finally get around to making a capital gain on the asset, then of course you can deduct it against that capital gain.
Do you think the government will do that?
It's hard to know. I think one of the reasons that negative gearing is becoming an increasing concern is that people have figured out that the reason that my child can't afford to buy a house is that somebody else, usually older, is negatively gearing a property, and that's pushing up the price of housing. And because that linkage has been made between negative gearing and housing affordability, and there's plenty of good reasons why that linkage has been made. It's economically completely rational. That is in fact exactly what's going on. And because of course home ownership is such a big deal in Australia, I think that as a policy, it's in trouble. And when you step back and say, so why do we have this policy? What's the social good that it's doing? It's tough to see. Only 5% of negatively geared properties are new properties. The remaining 95% are old things. So this is a policy that's not actually encouraging very much in the way of housing development. So it lacks a rationale.
So what do you think the government needs to do about the budget, just finally?
Well, I think what they will need to do is firstly look at the tax side. If you don't look at the tax side, then it's very hard to argue that people in the top half are pulling their weight. Negative gearing is the obvious target, and then the other obvious target is around superannuation tax concessions, which overwhelmingly favour those who are old and rich, and in particular they could be cut back in a way that would have no impact on most people, but a very substantial impact, so that people who are old and rich paid a wee bit more tax. And then secondly, I think they're going to need to look at some of these own goals. What they're doing in New Start is probably going to result in long-run increases in homelessness, the cost of which of course is enormous. What they're doing on medical co-payments is probably going to lead to a net reduction in the quality of the nation's health in the long run. They're going to need to say those things are never going to pass the Senate, so we'll abandon them, and paid parental leave is probably in the same category. And then what that might do is give them a chance to get some of the quite important structural reforms that are in the budget to have a wee bit more airplay. So we are talking about an extension in the pension age so that you can't claim the pension till you're 70. We're talking about the changes in indexation to a number of pension arrangements. We're talking about other structural reforms in the budget which are sensible and worthwhile and need a bit of airplay. Things even like the fuel excise levy is a perfectly sensible thing to do in terms of fixing the budget from a structural position. And if they can get rid of some of the things that are most politically damaging, that will give them a chance to give those important structural changes a bit more air.
Thanks, John.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Alan.